Chosen 1. Periods of major transition in a person's life are rarely introduced with obvious signals. More often, they begin quietly, marked not by external disruption, but by subtle internal changes. Individuals approaching such transitions frequently report a sense of misalignment with familiar environments, routines, and conversations. What once felt natural begins to feel restrictive. This phenomenon is not sudden instability. It is often the earliest indicator of a broader realignment process. In many cases, this phase is characterized by heightened awareness rather than confusion. People become more selective in their responses, more deliberate in their decisions, and more reflective about their surroundings. Silence replaces impulsive reaction. Observation replaces explanation. These behavioral shifts are frequently misinterpreted as withdrawal, when in reality they reflect an internal recalibration. This stage often emerges before clarity is available. The individual senses movement without knowing the destination. While this ambiguity can feel unsettling, it serves a functional purpose. Early disclosure or premature explanation can invite interference, pressure, or misinterpretation. For this reason, transitional phases tend to be recognized internally before they are acknowledged publicly. In psychological and sociological terms, this period reflects a separation from previously assigned identities. Labels that once defined a person, professional, relational, spiritual, or social, begin to lose relevance. This is not a rejection of the past, but a recognition that previous frameworks no longer provide sufficient scope for future responsibility. Such separation does not imply secrecy rooted in fear. Instead, it often reflects strategic withdrawal. When individuals are preparing to assume roles that require greater autonomy, visibility can become a liability. External expectations can limit experimentation, learning, and growth. As a result, many significant transitions unfold outside public awareness until structural stability is achieved. During this time, people frequently report a heightened sense of being observed rather than overlooked. This perception does not necessarily relate to human attention, but to accountability. As responsibility increases, so does internal scrutiny. Decisions are evaluated more carefully because consequences carry greater weight. One notable shift during this stage is the movement from compliance to authority. Earlier phases of development often emphasize obedience following established rules, structures, or expectations. Maturity introduces discernment. Rather than acting in response to instruction alone, individuals begin to operate from principle. This shift can feel destabilizing because it removes familiar guidance systems, but it is essential for autonomy. This internal transition often manifests as discomfort. Old roles feel constrictive. Familiar dynamics feel insufficient. This discomfort is frequently mistaken for uncertainty, when it is more accurately described as confirmation that growth is occurring. Stability at one level inevitably produces tension when capacity expands. Another defining feature of this phase is the inability to conform through imitation. Individuals may admire others who appear successful or established, yet find replication impossible. This resistance to imitation is not defiance. It reflects originality. Systems designed for replication cannot accommodate unique configurations. In this context, what may appear fragmented in hindsight often proves functional. Experiences that once seemed unrelated, successes, failures, delays, and contradictions begin to align. This integration process transforms isolated traits into a cohesive operating system. Skills, sensitivities, analytical abilities, and resilience converge into a structure that cannot be easily categorized. This convergence is rarely accidental. It reflects adaptive development shaped by environment, experience, and constraint. Rather than being assembled from a standardized template, the individual emerges through accumulation. This often explains why comparison with others consistently fails to provide direction or validation. Externally, the earliest visible indicator of this internal shift is environmental change. This may include relocation, professional repositioning, or a shift in social context. Geography, both literal and symbolic, plays a critical role in development. Certain environments reinforce past behaviors. Others activate future potential. When individuals are repositioned into new environments, they encounter unfamiliar rhythms, values, and expectations. While initially disorienting, these settings often provide the stimulation necessary for growth. Remaining in environments that mirror the past can reinforce outdated identities, delaying progress. Such movement is frequently resisted due to attachment, convenience, or fear of uncertainty. However, resistance tends to prolong discomfort rather than prevent change. Alignment often requires leaving contexts that no longer support development. As external surroundings change, cognitive patterns begin to shift. Survival-oriented thinking gives way to strategic awareness. Decisions become less reactive and more deliberate. Emotional regulation improves, not through suppression, but through understanding. This cognitive realignment is often misinterpreted by others as emotional distance. In reality, it reflects improved boundary management. Individuals become less responsive to noise and more responsive to relevance. This change can alter relationship dynamics significantly. As a result, relational shifts are common. Connections that were once central may weaken or dissolve, not due to conflict, but due to incompatibility. Relationships based on familiarity rather than alignment often struggle to adapt to growth. Conversely, new relationships emerge that reflect shared purpose, values, or trajectory. These connections tend to form quickly and feel intuitive. Trust develops more rapidly. Because alignment replaces negotiation. It is important to note that these changes are not moral judgments. They do not imply superiority or rejection. They reflect functional alignment. Relationships, like systems, operate most effectively when components are compatible. Once environmental and relational adjustments are underway, momentum begins to build. Opportunities, challenges, and responsibilities arrive in closer succession. This acceleration phase requires decisiveness. Hesitation becomes costly, not because caution is wrong, but because timing becomes critical. This stage is demanding. It tests adaptability, judgment, and endurance. Previous habits may prove insufficient. Systems must be refined quickly. Feedback loops shorten. Outcomes become more immediate. Despite the intensity, this phase is not chaotic. It is structured acceleration. Each decision compounds. Each action reinforces direction. While the pace may feel unfamiliar, it reflects readiness rather than pressure. As momentum increases, external resistance often diminishes. Obstacles that once blocked progress either dissolve or become manageable. This is not coincidence. It reflects alignment between capacity and context. At this point, change is no longer incremental. It becomes transformative. Identity, behavior, and environment begin to synchronize. Old assumptions lose relevance. New frameworks emerge organically. This transformation is comprehensive. It affects professional direction, personal relationships, internal values, and long-term objectives. Comfort becomes less important than coherence. Familiarity yields to function. While this process can be unsettling, it is also clarifying. Fragmentation decreases. Energy consolidates. Purpose becomes more defined through action rather than declaration. As the individual approaches the next phase, the pace of change continues to increase. What once required extended effort now unfolds more quickly. Systems built over time begin to perform at scale. This acceleration is not arbitrary. It reflects accumulated preparation. Skills developed in isolation are now deployed collectively. Experience translates into efficiency. At this point, the individual is no longer waiting for permission or validation. Movement becomes self-directed. External confirmation becomes secondary to internal alignment. This marks the end of preparation and the beginning of deployment. Once the phase of preparation gives way to active deployment, the nature of daily experience changes in measurable ways. The individual is no longer orienting themselves toward possibility. They are operating within it. Actions begin to produce.
Faster outcomes and decisions carry broader implications. This is the point at which alignment moves from an internal state into an external force. One of the most noticeable changes during this stage is the compression of time. Processes that previously required extended effort, negotiation, or repetition begin to unfold more efficiently. This is not because complexity has disappeared, but because internal clarity reduces friction. When intention, skill, and timing converge, execution becomes more direct. With this compression comes increased responsibility. Momentum attracts attention, expectation, and demand. Tasks arrive in clusters rather than sequences. The margin for indecision narrows. While this pace can feel intense, it also provides immediate feedback. Each choice reinforces or corrects direction. In real-time at this stage, adaptability becomes essential. Rigid adherence to outdated strategies can quickly undermine progress. Systems must remain responsive without becoming unstable. This balance is achieved through continuous evaluation rather than constant revision. The goal is not to change direction frequently, but to adjust methods as conditions evolve. Internally, this phase often brings a recalibration of confidence. Confidence here does not manifest as certainty about outcomes, but as trust in process. The individual recognizes that not every variable can be controlled, yet remains willing to act decisively. This form of confidence is quiet, functional, and grounded in experience rather than prediction. As influence expands, so does visibility. Others begin to respond differently, sometimes attributing authority or leadership where none was previously assigned. This shift can be subtle or overt, but it is rarely neutral. Presence alone begins to shape interactions, conversations, and expectations. This visibility introduces a new set of challenges. Projection becomes common. People may assign motives, intentions, or capacities that are incomplete or inaccurate. Managing this requires restraint. Overcorrection through explanation often creates more distortion. Consistency, rather than clarification, becomes the primary tool for maintaining integrity. Another defining characteristic of this stage is the integration of past difficulty into present effectiveness. Experiences that once appeared disruptive or limiting now function as reference points. Challenges become resources. Previous failures inform strategy. Delays provide perspective. This integration reduces fear of setback. When difficulty is understood as instructive rather than punitive, resilience increases. The individual becomes less reactive to obstacles and more analytical. Problems are approached as variables to be assessed rather than threats to be avoided. As a result, obstacles begin to function differently. They no longer halt progress. Instead, they redirect it. A blocked path often reveals an alternative route that proves more efficient or aligned. This reframing changes the emotional tone of challenge. From frustration to curiosity, during this phase, creativity takes on a more applied role. Ideas are no longer speculative, they are operational. Innovation emerges through problem solving rather than inspiration alone. The ability to synthesize information across domains becomes particularly valuable. This synthesis often produces solutions that feel unconventional yet effective, because the individual is no longer constrained by rigid categories. They can combine analytical reasoning with intuition, structure with flexibility. This hybrid approach allows for responses that are both precise and adaptive. Leadership frequently emerges here, whether formally assigned or informally assumed. Others begin to seek guidance, input, or direction. This leadership is rarely announced. It develops through reliability, clarity, and follow-through. Effective leadership at this stage is less about authority and more about example, actions. Demonstrate standards. Decisions model priorities. Consistency builds trust without requiring assertion. Influence grows organically through demonstrated competence. Importantly, this leadership also includes the ability to activate others. Rather than centralizing control, aligned leadership distributes responsibility. It recognizes capacity in others and creates conditions for it to surface. This multiplication effect expands impact beyond individual effort. As influence grows, the external environment begins to reflect internal alignment more consistently. Opportunities appear with greater relevance. Connections form with less negotiation. Resources become accessible when needed rather than pursued prematurely. This does not mean every outcome is favorable. It means outcomes are instructive. Even when results differ from expectation, they provide actionable information. This feedback loop accelerates learning and reduces stagnation. At this point, progress becomes compounding. Small actions produce outsized effects. Incremental improvements stack quickly. Momentum builds not through force, but through coherence. This compounding effect also applies to decision-making. Choices made with clarity reinforce future clarity. Hesitation diminishes, intuition sharpens. Informed by pattern recognition rather than impulse. As the pace continues to increase, the individual may notice a reduction in tolerance for distraction. Activities, conversations, or environments that fragment attention become increasingly uncomfortable. This is not impatience. It is efficiency asserting itself. Focus narrows, not in scope, but in relevance. Energy is allocated more deliberately. Commitments are evaluated against long-term objectives rather than short-term convenience. This selectivity protects sustainability. Sustainability becomes critical during this phase. Burnout remains a risk, particularly when momentum is high. Maintaining balance requires deliberate pauses for assessment and recovery. These pauses are strategic, not indulgent. Reflection continues to play a central role. However, reflection here is forward-oriented. It evaluates effectiveness rather than identity. Questions shift from "who am I becoming?" to "is this working as intended?" This shift marks a maturation of self-concept. Identity stabilizes. Purpose becomes operational rather than aspirational. The individual no longer seeks transformation, they manage it. As this management stabilizes, external validation loses significance. Feedback is considered, but not internalized indiscriminately. Self-assessment becomes the primary reference point. This internal authority supports ethical consistency. Decisions are guided by principle rather than pressure. Short-term advantage is weighed against long-term coherence. Integrity becomes a practical asset rather than an abstract value. Over time, this consistency produces trust at scale. Stakeholders, collaborators, and observers recognize reliability. This trust reduces friction in future interactions. Negotiations shorten. Agreements solidify more quickly. Another notable development during this stage is the alignment of material and non-material outcomes. Professional advancement, financial stability, and resource access begin to align with internal values rather than compete with them. This integration reduces internal conflict. When material outcomes support rather than distract from purpose, effectiveness increases. Resources become tools rather than temptations. Security enables focus rather than complacency. This does not eliminate ethical tension, but it reframes it. Choices involve optimization rather than compromise. The individual learns to navigate complexity without sacrificing coherence. As alignment deepens, moments that once felt extraordinary begin to feel routine. This normalization does not diminish their significance. It reflects adaptation. Capacity has expanded to accommodate what was once exceptional. This adaptation is often accompanied by gratitude rather than entitlement. Awareness of trajectory reinforces humility. Progress is recognized as cumulative rather than accidental. At this stage, the individual may experience a sense of inevitability not in outcome, but in direction. While specifics remain uncertain, movement feels guided rather than random. Confidence is rooted in process rather than prediction. This sense of direction supports long-term planning. Vision extends beyond immediate objectives. Strategies account for sustainability, succession, and impact. Thinking shifts from execution to stewardship. Stewardship reflects an understanding that influence carries obligation. Decisions affect not only personal outcomes, but systems, communities, and futures. This awareness tempers ambition with responsibility. As the individual assumes this responsibility, the role they occupy becomes less personal and more functional. Identity is expressed through contribution rather than recognition. Satisfaction derives from effectiveness rather than approval. This marks a significant transition. The work is no longer about proving capability. It is about applying it consistently. Growth continues, but it is integrated into operation rather than pursued as an end in itself. By the end of this phase, the individual is no longer defined by transition. They are defined by execution. Alignment has moved from preparation to practice, from insight to infrastructure. What follows is not a return to stability, but an ongoing cycle of refinement, contribution, and impact. The foundation is set. The system is active. The direction is established. From here, progress is no longer speculative. It is structural. The final stage is not defined by arrival, but by consolidation. What has been built, tested, and refined now enters a phase of sustained operation. This is where momentum is no longer fragile, and direction is no longer questioned. The work continues, but its nature changes. Effort shifts from expansion to calibration, from acceleration to endurance. At this point, systems that were once actively constructed begin to self-regulate. Habits, structures, and decision-making frameworks operate with less conscious input. This does not imply passivity. It reflects internalization. Skills have moved from deliberate practice into functional instinct. One of the most significant developments in this phase is the stabilization of judgment. Decisions are no longer weighed primarily through external comparison or internal doubt. Instead, they are evaluated against established principles and long-term objectives. This creates consistency across contexts, even when circumstances vary. Stability in judgment reduces cognitive load. Energy previously consumed by uncertainty becomes available for higher-order thinking. Strategic planning improves. Foresight extends further. Risks are assessed more accurately because emotional interference is minimal. This clarity also alters the experience of pressure. Challenges still arise, but they no longer trigger disproportionate response. Stress becomes informational rather than overwhelming. It signals areas requiring attention, adjustment, or reinforcement. With this shift, the individual gains the ability to operate effectively under sustained demand. This capacity is not built through constant exertion, but through efficient energy allocation. Effort is applied precisely where it produces impact, rather than dispersed broadly. Efficiency here is not synonymous with speed. It is about appropriateness. Tasks are addressed at the right moment, with the right intensity. This timing prevents unnecessary escalation and preserves resources for critical decisions. Another defining feature of this phase is the refinement of communication. Language becomes more deliberate. Messages are concise, structured, and purpose-driven. This precision reduces misunderstanding and aligns expectations across stakeholders. Clear communication also strengthens boundaries. Limits are established without hostility. Commitments are defined without overextension. This protects focus and reinforces credibility. Others learn to interact within these parameters, further reducing friction. As credibility accumulates, trust becomes less conditional. Past performance establishes a baseline expectation of reliability. This trust simplifies collaboration. Processes move forward with fewer checkpoints and approvals dot at the same time. Accountability increases. Higher trust brings higher stakes. Outcomes are attributed more directly. Success and failure are both more visible. This requires continued discipline and self-regulation in this phase. Self-regulation is less about restraint and more about alignment. The individual does not need to suppress impulses. Priorities are already integrated. Choices that conflict with long-term objectives simply lose appeal. This integration also affects motivation. External incentives become secondary. Motivation is sustained by coherence between action and purpose. Work feels necessary rather than forced, meaningful rather than performative. Meaning here is not abstract. It is derived from observable impact. Results can be measured, evaluated, and improved. Feedback loops remain active, ensuring that effort continues to translate into value. As impact stabilizes, attention often shifts outward. The individual becomes more aware of the systems they influence and the people affected by their decisions. This awareness introduces a broader ethical dimension to action. Ethical consistency becomes operational rather than aspirational. Principles are applied in real scenarios, under real constraints. Trade-offs are navigated with transparency and intention. This does not eliminate complexity. Ethical decisions often involve competing goods rather than clear right and wrong. What changes is the approach. Decisions are made with full awareness of consequences, rather than avoidance of responsibility. With this awareness comes a deeper sense of stewardship. Resources, authority, and influence are treated as responsibilities to be managed, not assets to be exploited. This perspective sustains long-term viability. Stewardship also extends to self-management. The individual recognizes that their capacity is a limiting factor. Rest, recovery, and renewal are treated as strategic necessities rather than optional luxuries. This recognition prevents burnout and preserves clarity. Periods of withdrawal are used intentionally to reassess direction, reinforce systems, and integrate new information. These intervals enhance effectiveness rather than interrupt it. Another notable characteristic of this phase is resilience through redundancy. Systems are designed to function even when individual components fail. Processes are documented. Knowledge is shared. Dependency on constant personal oversight decreases. This redundancy does not reduce importance. It increases scale. By reducing bottlenecks, the individual enables broader participation and continuity. Impact becomes less fragile and more distributable as systems mature. Innovation continues, but it is selective. Not every new idea is pursued. Innovation is evaluated based on relevance, feasibility, and alignment with long-term goals. This discernment protects focus. When innovation is adopted, it is integrated thoughtfully. Changes are tested, measured, and adjusted. Disruption is minimized. Stability is preserved even as evolution continues. Over time, this balance between stability and adaptability becomes a defining strength. The individual is neither rigid nor reactive. They can respond to change without losing coherence. This capacity is particularly important as external conditions shift. Markets fluctuate, environments evolve, expectations change. The individual remains effective because their core systems are adaptable by design. As adaptability increases, fear of uncertainty decreases. Unknown variables are approached with analysis rather than anxiety. This composure enhances decision quality under ambiguous conditions. Another shift in this phase is the reframing of legacy. Legacy is no longer associated with recognition or permanence. It is understood as the durability of systems, the transfer of knowledge, and the continuity of values. This perspective encourages mentorship and knowledge sharing. Experience is not guarded, it is disseminated. Others are supported in developing their own capacity rather than remaining dependent. Mentorship here is practical rather than ideological. It focuses on skills, judgment, and process. Guidance is tailored to context rather than generalized. As others grow, the individual's role evolves again. Direct involvement decreases in some areas, while oversight and strategic direction increase. This transition requires trust and patience. Trust is reinforced through clear frameworks and shared standards. Autonomy is granted within defined boundaries. Accountability is maintained through transparent metrics rather than constant supervision. This structure supports scalability. Impact extends beyond individual effort. Outcomes reflect collective capability rather than personal exertion. At this stage, satisfaction often becomes quieter. There are fewer dramatic milestones. Progress is incremental and continuous. This requires a different form of appreciation. Appreciation is found in consistency, reliability, and sustained effectiveness. The absence of crisis becomes a success indicator. Stability is recognized as an achievement. This recognition reinforces commitment. The individual continues not because they seek validation, but because the work remains necessary and effective. Over time, the distinction between personal and professional identity continues to blur, not through imbalance, but through integration. Values expressed in one domain are reflected in the other. This integration reduces internal conflict. Decisions feel coherent across contexts. There is less compartmentalization, less role switching. The individual operates from a unified framework. This unity supports long-term well-being. Psychological strain decreases when actions align consistently with values. Energy is conserved when internal contradictions are minimized. As the cycle continues, the individual remains open to refinement. No phase is final in the sense of completion. What is final is the transition from searching to sustaining. The focus is no longer on becoming, but on maintaining effectiveness while allowing for gradual evolution. Growth is measured in depth rather than speed. In this final phase, progress is no longer questioned. It is observed. Systems function. Impact persists. Direction holds. What lies ahead is not uncertainty, but responsibility to continue applying clarity, discipline, and awareness in service of outcomes that extend beyond the self. This is not an endpoint. It is a steady state of contribution, adaptation, and stewardship. The work continues, grounded in structure, guided by principle, and sustained by coherence. If you have reached this point, pause for a moment before moving on. Finishing a message of this length already says something important about you. It means you are not just consuming words for distraction. You are looking for structure, for clarity, for something that helps you make sense of where you are and where you are going. That kind of attention is intentional, and intention is where real change begins. Now the question is simple, but significant. What will you do with what you have just taken in? This is not a message meant to stay abstract. It is not designed to sit quietly in the background of your mind while life continues unchanged. Its purpose is practical. It is meant to shift how you think, how you decide, and how you act slowly, consistently, and with awareness. The first step is acknowledgement. Acknowledge what resonated. Not everything you heard will apply to you equally, and that is fine. Identify the parts that felt precise, the ideas that seemed to describe your current stage accurately. That recognition is not coincidence. It is alignment. Once you identify that alignment, anchor it. Do not rely on memory alone. Write it down. One insight, one sentence, one realization that stood out. Writing turns passive understanding into something concrete. It gives the idea weight. Next, translate insight into action. Not a dramatic overhaul, not a long list of promises. Just one adjustment you can make immediately. Something small but specific. A boundary you need to reinforce. a habit you need to revisit, a behavior you need to stop excusing. Action is what separates reflection from progress. If you are watching this content regularly, understand that repetition matters. Growth does not happen because of a single moment of clarity. It happens because clarity is revisited, reinforced, and practiced. That is why continued engagement is important, not out of obligation, but out of consistency. If this message added value, support it intentionally. Like it, not as a reflex, but as a signal. Comment, not with vague praise, but with something meaningful. What resonated, what challenged you, or what you are choosing to apply. Engagement deepens understanding, both for you and for others who are navigating similar questions. Sharing also matters, not for reach alone, but for relevance. If you know someone who is at a similar stage, questioning direction, refining priorities, seeking stability rather than noise, send this to them. Not everyone needs more motivation. Some people need clarity. Some need permission to slow down and build properly. If you want to continue receiving content that emphasizes structure over hype, depth over urgency, and long-term coherence over quick fixes, then choose that deliberately. Subscribe, follow, or return with intention. Let your attention reflect your priorities. At the same time, remember this clearly: no message, no channel, no voice replaces responsibility. Information can guide, but it cannot act for you. The most important work happens away from the screen in daily decisions, repeated habits, and quiet discipline. If you feel resistance right now, do not ignore it. Resistance often appears when something true demands change. Instead of pushing it away, examine it. Ask yourself what it is protecting: comfort, familiarity, fear of effort. Awareness of resistance is a form of progress. You do not need certainty to move forward. You need direction. Direction becomes clearer through action, not endless analysis. Start with what you know. Adjust as you learn. Progress is iterative. If this content helped you frame your current stage more clearly, mark that moment. Respond, engage, not for validation, but for reinforcement. Let your external actions support your internal decision. Return to these principles as you move forward. Consistency over intensity, clarity over noise, alignment over impulse. These are not slogans. They are operating standards. When applied consistently, they change outcomes. What comes next is not about watching more, reading more, or waiting longer. It is about implementation. One decision, one adjustment, one step taken with awareness. If you are ready to continue building with structure and intention, stay connected. Apply what you take in. Let progress unfold through disciplined alignment rather than forced urgency. The choice is already in front of you. What you do next determines whether this message was simply heard or actually used.